Hello, Tennessee Voices viewers and listeners. This is David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee and the Tennessean. Today, I have the pleasure of having as my guest, Diana Sanchez-Vega, who is the founder and CEO of Sanchez-Vega Communications, providing communications training for healthcare and education, the community as a whole. Diana, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, David. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and congratulations on such a great project that you're doing here.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to have you today. And for those who are not familiar with your work, would you talk a little bit about Sanchez-Vega Communications and the work you've been doing?
Yes, sure. So at Sanchez-Vega Communications, David, our mission is to empower bilingual and multilingual individuals to really monetize the true value of their bilingualism. And how we do that is by providing customized career coaching services, delivering comprehensive interpreter, like verbal translators, interpreter trainings, and really partnering with organizations that invest in bilingual and multilingual human resources to positively impact their bottom line. So in a nutshell, I know that sounded like an elevator speech. It is. In a nutshell, the goal, David, is to really bring out that skill of bilingualism, multilingualism, which takes decades to become proficient in, and really offer it as a value, both to the individual, but also to the organizations.
And can you talk a little bit more about that? Because oftentimes I know in organizations, when I've talked to other bilingual professionals, people think oftentimes, well, that's easy, or can you translate this for me? You know, things like that people take for granted. As a former Spanish language editor myself, I appreciate how challenging that question is, and especially because of cultural context. But can you talk a little bit about what it really takes to be someone who is a bilingual professional?
Absolutely. Thank you. And especially coming from someone who's done that work before, you know how it is. It's not like switching, turning on and off a switch. So the first thing I always bring up, and this is something that some of us that are in the industry of interpreting have a little bit as pet peeves, so just bear with me, is that the main difference between translators and interpreters. So translators work with the written word. So anytime you are transferring a message that is written, let's say from English into Spanish, you are doing a translation. The particulars of that is that you might be running on a deadline, but usually you have the resources to go back and correct and edit and correct and really look at, as you said, the context. Because if we look at automated translations like Google Translate or stuff like that, you can type in a term and it pops up in the other language. But really, that might not be the concept or the connotation of that term in what you are translating in that document. So you really have to do a little bit, more research if that doesn't come out so straightforward. Interpreters, on the other hand, work with the spoken word. And so I like to compare it, like when you think about, because I'm a recovering actress, David. I used to act. We're not going to talk about that. That's for another video cast. But, in acting, you have theater acting and you have on-screen acting. So theater acting, when the lights are on, it's showtime. If you make a mistake, you need to think really fast on your feet and, figure it out. Whereas translators, as I said, it's more like if you're thinking about a movie, right, where you go back and you edit and you cut and then you get the final product. Both are super important, but both have to work together as far as we might be as interpreters looking at a document that is in English, for example, or vice versa, let's say in Spanish. And then we have to speak it, which is one of the modes of interpretation, into the language of, let's say in English, if it's for a provider or a school administrator. So what we focus on at Sanchez-Vega Communications, although we do translations regularly for a variety of clients, is the training for interpreters. Because the skills that are needed for interpretation, David, are as many as translators, but there's the real-time component of it.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things you make me think about is this Miss Universe pageant. And I know it sounds trite, but it cost a contestant the win because there was a word that was translated incorrectly. The one contestant was asked about what her favorite dish was. She was from Venezuela, and she said ropa vieja, which literally means old clothes. But it's a dish that, of pulled beef. And the interpreter who was from Spain thought she was actually saying she liked to eat dirty clothes. And so it created all this confusion. So knowing context and also knowing that so many different countries may have different meanings for different words.
Yes, and this ropa vieja, by the way, is delicious. I'm a foodie, so I love that dish. But there's this ongoing conversation about the different meanings, as you gave the example here of two Spanish-speaking countries, but just different countries that have different connotations for a term or a phrase. We talk about dialects and regionalisms, and I go back and forth. If you go to Wikipedia, it talks about dialects, but because I was really trained with a very strong language foundation, because I attended English and bilingual schools for 15 years in Argentina, the truth is those are regionalisms, right? So the Spanish spoken in Spain versus the Spanish spoken in Colombia, the Spanish spoken in Argentina, the formation of the language is the same. It's different like when we think about the regions in Spain. So if you think about the Basque language and about the Aragonese language, right? Those are actually the formation of words are different and the structure is different. So those are dialects. But when we think about the varieties of terms, we talk about regionalisms. Mm-hmm. But you will find a lot of people saying they're dialects and really they're not, because it's just you have this meaning. I have many stories about when I moved to the US, I had a very strong foundation of British English. And so I would use terms initially just because they came out. And it took me a few months, to really get into the American English.
That's a great example right there, because oftentimes, I had a chance to study in Spain and in Seville, and the Spanish there is very different. There's what they call the habla andaluza, which is still a type of Castilian, but it's an accent that is very prevalent. That you hear it a lot in the Caribbean, in the Americas. So, I mean, that's something that one has to keep in mind. So you're using a part of the brain. Not only are you having to think on your feet about this, but you're then having to think on your feet about two languages in process. And so how do you teach that?
I know, right? It's kind of crazy. You don't want to be inside this brain. Okay. So really, we work incrementally. So the very first thing, David, that we do is really review the background, like what justifies this exponential growth of interpreters. And as I was saying earlier to you right before we started recording, our focus is healthcare and education. So we don't train on legal interpreting, which, of course, is super important as well. But the need for educating in these two specific fields has grown exponentially. So first we review what is like the legal framework, like what justifies us as professionals, right, to be there. Like why is it? Like why are non-English speakers provided interpreters and why is it a right for them? So we review that. Then we go into a little more specific. So we start from very general to specific, and we review ethics and standards and protocols when we are what we call in the room, whether the room is over the phone interpreting, video interpreting, or just on site, both for schools, right? And we're talking about K-12 here, and healthcare facilities. Then we make this switch. We start covering, and we start first with healthcare and then do the same process in education, very specific terminology about the field. So as interpreters, I mean, if we interpret usually healthcare interpreters, we interpret across specialties. So it would be a little crazy for us to know every single term in every single specialty. I don't even think providers know it, right? Doctors. So we just hone in on the very basic that we have to know. What we have to know is a concept. For example, if the provider tells the patient is, I think I'm going to have you do a stress, let me give an example. I think I'm going to have an endoscopy done for you. They need to know that that's not a treatment, that that's a diagnostic test. They need to know that that means that there's going to be a separate appointment. And it's not that the interpreter is saying all that, but as the doctor is talking, and you talked a little bit while ago, David, about context, when we are there, especially because time is of the essence, right? The doctor has to move on to the next patient. We need to know those concepts. So we review those basic concepts within the different, let's say, anatomy systems, physiology, and medical specialties. And then we go into a practice, right? Then we start, it's like, okay, you have everything you need, you understand where you're at. Now we do practice. And all our trainings are via Zoom. And so I bring in language coaches because Spanish is my first language, and I speak a not very decent Portuguese, so I'm not going to go there. And I'm not an accent person, so my French, my very basic French would never work, would never be enough for interpreting. So I have Arabic language coaches, Mandarin, Kurdish, just a variety of languages that come in during these practice sessions. And so we just do practice sessions the same way you would do in anything that you have to execute live, right? And we go back and forth, and we do it with audio, we do it with video, we explain how it would be on site. And it's kind of fun also because, you know, usually when training participants, they're like, oh no, now I have to do this. I'm like, it's okay, you can do this. It's kind of learning how to drive, you know? You're like, I don't want to take that driving skills test. This is the interpreting skills test. You can do it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Before we continue, we're at the part of the conversation where I like to ask guests what they've been doing for their own self-care. Leaders have a lot on their shoulders. So what are you reading, watching, doing to keep yourself healthy and well?
That's a great question. I like to listen to podcasts, but I have one, and I love her, who's Dominic Bertolucci. I'm not sure if you've heard her. She's a life coach, and she keeps me grounded. She's very real. She just like tells you how it is. And she really talks about a mindset shift, what for me was very important because I had to pivot from on-site trainings to, you know, when I was just like anybody else, nothing different. But as a small business owner, you know, you wear so many hats. So I have to really, really schedule my happy work time, what I call happy work time, and my time off. I love doing jigsaw puzzles, and I can be in my home for a full weekend. You know, I don't turn off the phone and stuff, but I have my jigsaw puzzle, I have my glass of wine in the evening, I have my music, and I just focus on something. And sometimes when I've had, you know, a lot of this, David, is very tough, right? Because we're interpreting a lot for people that have COVID and who are being given, you know, family members are being given bad news, and we're there. End of life interpreting is hard. So when that happens, you know, I can't go and get massages because of COVID and stuff, but I kind of pamper myself and just really, really take time off so that I can reset and recharge.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's very powerful. Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about your origin story of how did you get into this field, and also how did you become a business owner, because that's a big leap as well.
Yes. So I am one of those people, and I think you're possibly one of those too, David, that I grew up bilingual. I'm bicultural. So when I learned to speak, I learned to speak both English and Spanish. So for me, interpreting is very organic. It's something that I've done all my life through school, you know, when I was going K-12 school. But then when, you know, I was raised by an American stepfather, so we had visitors, I was always like, oh, you know, just why don't you interpret for them, and, you know, take them out on the town and kind of show them Buenos Aires, you know, and stuff like that. So I would do that. But the other thing is, when I moved here, I've been in the US for over 20, moved here in 99, in December of 99. Everybody told me, you have languages, you're going to do great, you're going to do great. And it's not that I didn't, but I really, really noticed that it was great if I spoke Spanish, but there was not a value behind it. It was the, you know, it's like, yeah, we love you because you speak Spanish. And I'm like, how much more are you going to pay me for that? right? And then I kind of transitioned into, the area of healthcare. I tried legal, I didn't like it. So interpreting was a skill that I already brought with me, but the language I already brought with me. And I'm like, okay, let me make a living with this. And I worked for just a few companies. I worked for the Tennessean briefly for short of a year. I've worked for different organizations, did a lot of work in the nonprofit world, studied and run a nonprofit, but eventually I really realized that the way that I would be able to really create something that can stay, and I'm not sure legacy is something, but something that someone else can grab then and run with it, was being a business owner. And I come from a long line, David, I have to say this because I have to honor those that came before me, of very pioneer women. My maternal grandmother was the first female customs agent in Argentina. Customs agents did not want women, right? They were like, oh no, we're at the airport. She said, doesn't matter. I can be there. No, we wear pants, right? They're like, doesn't matter. And my mom was the first woman who started, and I'm talking about the 80s here, the early 80s. So forget online dating, forget all that. She had a dating agency, right? Where you would interview in person, you would go to her office and meet her, right? And say, I'm looking for the love of my life. And she was the first one to start advertising that because it was a formal thing for people to get married in one of the most conservative newspapers in Buenos Aires. And the editor, David, and you're going to appreciate this because you work for a newspaper. The editor would not want her to place ads. And she's like, this is serious business. This is not like for people to have like a very transitional thing. This is for people who are looking for a lifetime partnership. And for a month and a half, she sent them letters until the editor said, fine, place the ad. So that's where I come from. And so I'm on this mission to really empower individuals to monetize the true value of their bilingualism, because it's an amazing skill.
Thank you so much for talking about that, because I know that one of the things that, to go back to an earlier point, when people are asked from the standpoint of translation, the written aspect of it, to just translate this document, well, it's not on the fly necessarily, it does also take time. And it's one of those things where you just can't, you can try a Google Translate, but it's not perfect by any means.
Oh, no. And a lot of people have gotten in trouble. And as you gave the example about the pageant, and unfortunately we have some cases where it's people's medical condition, right? And it's Google Translate is used. So the patient, it's used for many times for labels, like in pharmacy, they translate the labels, and maybe they have to take 2 pills 1 time a day, and they end up taking 1 pill twice a day, right? So so the medication doesn't have the effect, and then they go back and they say, well, but I sent the orders. So there's so many intricacies that can happen when not proper interpretation or translation services are used.
It's interesting with the medical field. When I've been thinking about the work that I did many years ago, there were issues, especially translation foibles when it came to diabetes, because of terms like sugar and blood and these things. Sometimes there's colloquialisms that people will use that could be interpreted as something that is not necessarily what the situation is. So I can imagine that's very difficult.
Yeah. And it's, it also, I always say, interpreters say, oh, but the doctors, and I'm like, well, are you doing your part? Like, are you doing your work? Are you making sure that you are, our main tool, right? We have now the Winter Olympics going, right? Which I think is amazing, because I'm not an athletic person, and I see those folks competing, and I'm like, wow, this is incredible. But they work out besides practicing their own sport. So for us, that is stuff like glossaries, and staying up to date with different changes in the world of healthcare or rules in education, what can't be done. Like, if we as interpreters are not, like, when the COVID hit, I had to go, and every question was about COVID, and look for all this terminology. Like, how do I say all these terms in Spanish? How do I say this in English? So yeah, very important.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much, Diana, for being my guest today on the Tennessee Voices podcast. Before I let you go, I always like to ask guests if they would leave our audience with some words of wisdom to help them get through this challenging time.
Yes, it is that persistence pays off. Persistence always pays off. And really, really having hope that there's always a better option, because this is the United States of America. And that dream, that American dream, actually exists. So keep at it.
Well, I'm grateful to you again, Diana Sanchez-Vega, of the founder and CEO of Sanchez-Vega Communications. Best of success to you. May you stay well and healthy. And again, I'm grateful for you appearing on the show today.
Thank you so much, David, and same to you. Take care.
Thank you.